All right, we left off last time at the end of siman lamed tet, regarding checking tefillin. So we said generally that if you take it from a mumche, an expert, okay, in other words, somebody who's known to be an expert sofer, then the tefillin do not require checking. However, if you took them from a eino mumche, then they do need to be checked. We said that lechatchila you're not supposed to take from an eino mumche. Why? Because we're afraid that people will be reluctant to have the tefillin checked, right? Because as opposed to mezuzah, that it's very easy. You just open it and check it. Tefillin, you need to take it apart and put it back together. So lechatchila, you should only buy tefillin from a mumche. By the way, here the Mishnah Berurah says in seif chet, "Pashut demishu sofer kavua l'radim ubichlal mumche." In other words, somebody that's known to be sofer, he's considered to be a mumche. Nowadays, also we have a lot of places that have some sort of certification, for their making of tefillin. But probably all of those will be considered mumchim. However, if you took from a mumche or you didn't have where else to get from, then you need to have it checked. So that's what seif tet is about. And seif tet says, so if you took from a non-expert and not known to be expert sofer, then you need to have the tefillin checked. לקח ממנו 100 קציצות, בודק מהם 3 קציצות, 2 של ראש ואחת של יד, או 2 של יד ואחת של ראש. אם מצאם כשרים, הוא חוזק, זה האיש והרי כולם כשרים. So again, if you only bought one pair of tefillin, so you have them both checked, but let's say you bought 100 batim of tefillin, then you need to check 3 of them, right? Because as we know, 3 is a chazakah. However, the Gemara says that out of those 3, you should have some shel rosh, some shel yad. So either 2 shel rosh, 1 shel yad, 2 shel yad, 1 shel rosh, to make sure that he's doing both of them correctly. And then if all 3 came out okay, then he's a muchazak, that he knows what he's doing, and you don't need to check the rest. Okay. Okay, it's a bit hard to imagine this, but let's say the tefillin are sort of handed out in bundles. Okay. So so we assume each bundle is coming from a different sofer. Okay, and that's why I have this bundle and this bundle and that bundle. So therefore, so now you need to check each bundle of tefillin, 3 out of each bundle, because you assume each bundle is a separate sofer, and that's why each one needs to be established as a mumche. Okay. Finally, the Mechaber says, somebody who's selling tefillin, and he says this was tefillin that belonged to a great Talmid Chacham, so he is believed, and it doesn't need bdika. In other words, that we assume that the tefillin are kosher. So you have to be careful on some of this. All the Mechaber here is saying is that Ne'eman that the tefillin are kosher tefillin. I was just thinking about it because somebody told me that you saw an auction for mezuzot that belonged to Reb Chaim Kanievsky or something like that. He paid quite a sum for them. It turned out to be a fraud. But anyway, okay. So here the Mishnah Berurah says, in other words, if the seller tells you I took it from an expert sofer, then also he's ne'eman. Why? Right? It's just isurin, so עד אחד is נאמן, וכתב במגן אברהם, על כל פנים בעניין שמכירים אותו שהוא מוחזק בכשרות. Okay, we need somebody who's מוחזק בכשרות. In other words, he's a shomer mitzvot person, seems to be reliable. לפי המבואר שמוכח דעים ראינו שלבש בעצמו נאמן בכל גבני דלבש בעצמו בוודאי אינו חשוד. If we saw him himself wear it, then certainly we can trust him that he took it from a reliable sofer. Okay, so this is all what we spoke about, is checking tefillin at the beginning when you buy them. The question is, do you need to keep checking them on later on, afterwards? In other words, if let's say you bought from a mumche, so they didn't even need to be checked when you bought them, or you bought from a meino mumche and you had them checked and it was all good, or is there any point in time later on that you need to check it later on? Okay, so this is a very interesting question. There are a number, very famous question, a number of sources on this in the Rishonim. Let's skip to the source pages. Okay, so one of the earliest sources that we have on this is a Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says, Tani, תפילין צריך לבודקן אחת ל-12 חודש, דברי רבי. רשב"ג אומר, אינן צריכות בדיקה, הלל הזקן אומר, אלו מאבי אימהן. In other words, so the first opinion, Rebbe says you need to check tefillin once every 12 months. Rashba said you don't need to check them at all. And Hillel HaZaken, and the Yerushalmi seems to indicate that Hillel HaZaken says these are tefillin from my grandfather, and he continued using them without having them checked. From the context, that's what it seems like Hillel is saying. Okay? And that's what the Rambam rules. The Rambam says, הכותב תפילין בכתב ידו, או שלקחן ממומחה או משאר אדם ובדקן, והחזירן לאורם. In other words, so he either he bought tefillin for a mumche, so he didn't have to have them checked, or he bought it from somebody else and he checked them and he put it back into their boxes. אינו צריך לבודקם פעם אחרת אפילו לאחר כמה שנים. So he says you don't need to check them afterwards again, even after many years. כל זמן שחיפוין שלן הרי בחזקתם. As long as the bite is whole, then they're the chazaka. If the bite is not whole, then and they got exposed, then we're concerned they might have been damaged. However, as long as the bite is whole, the cover is whole, then the chazaka is that they're still in fine. We're not concerned that maybe a letter or something was erased or was the whole, because again, it's fully protected in the letter. Hillel HaZaken says, you know, these are from my grandfather. Okay, in other words, seemingly he didn't check them. Okay, the Tosfot and the Rosh quote some other sources on this question of whether tefillin need to be checked. See the Rosh in Hilchot Tefillin, who says as follows: שנינו במחילתא, אבל כאן ימימה ולנאמן נאמר ימים תהיה גאולתו. מה ימים אמור להלן אינו פחות מי"ב חודש, אף ימים אמור כאן אין פחות מי"ב חודש, מגיד שצריך לבדוק תפילין אחד לי"ב חודש דברי בית שמאי. בית הלל אומרים אין צריך בדיקה. In other words, according to this version, it's a machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, whether I need to check once in every 12 months. שמאי הזקן אומר, אלו תפילין של אבי אמא, כלומר שלא נבדקו מעולם. ובירושלמי בפרק בת ובאומן תענית תפילין צריך לבדקן פעם אחת י"ב חודש, דברי רבן שמעון ג' אומר, אין צריכים בדיקה. הלל הזקן אומר, אלו תפילין של אבי אמא. Okay, so until now the Rosh has brought, you know, the sources that we saw in the Yerushalmi, and he says also in the Mechilta that this appears as a machloket. And now he quotes something very interesting. ובשימוש הרבה, we know the Shimush Arab, again, is a work from the times of the Geonim that has a halachot on tefillin, and the Rishonim quote it quite often. You know, so they accept some of the Shimush Arab says, some of it they don't accept. בשירוש הרבה יש שצריך לבודקן פעמיים בשבוע. The Shimush Arab, it says to check tefillin twice every 7 years. שבוע, again, is the Shemitah cycle. וקצת יסד לדבריהם עם מזוזה. ואמרינן ביום שנבדקת פעמיים בשבוע. Right, mezuzah, there we know that the halacha is that you need to check them twice every 7 years. אלא שאין דומה בבדיקה דאירינן בהיינו שמתקלקל או בלהקה, קלף. בתפה יש לחוש במזוזה מזה, מפני לחלוכית מקומה והזרם והמטר. מפני לחלוכית מקומה והזרם והמטר. In other words, the Rosh says there's a difference between mezuzah and tefillin. Why? Because the mezuzah, where it's placed, it could get wet. Okay. However, tefillin, you don't need to be concerned from that. Okay. So the Rosh says that's why it's not similar to mezuzah. By the way, there is a slight indication here. One could claim that, you know, even by mezuzah, it sounds like a bit from the Rosh that he's talking about which mezuzah needs to be checked. The mezuzot which are on the doors facing outside, that they're really exposed to the weather. Okay, as opposed to, let's say, an inner mezuzah in the house, which is not exposed to the weather. Maybe it's less of a problem, but you could debate that. But anyway, he says tefillin, you know, it's not something that's usually exposed to the weather, So it doesn't need to be checked. Okay. There's one more source on this that the Beit Yosef quotes, and this is the in Orach Chaim. And he says here as follows. He brings the sources that we said. Now he brings a few interesting points. He says, "Vani shamati shekach nagru chachmei Tzrafat levodkan mishana leshana." In other words, there was a minhag in chachmei Tzrafat that they used to check every year, like the opinion of Rebbe or the opinion of Beit Shammai. ובתשובות גאונים מצאתי שמי שמניחן תמיד אין צריכים בדיקה אפילו ל50 שנה, הנה שהאוויר שולט בהם ואינן מתאפשות מבפנים. ואם אינו מניחן אל לב סרטים, בוודאי צריכים בדיקה, וכן שמענו מחכמים מסכנים ששמעו מרבותם, בערך פעמים בכל שבוע שהם זין שנים. Okay? In other words, according to this opinion, it's interesting, this is as follows. If you actually put on the tefillin every day, then they don't need to be checking. Why? The fact that they're exposed to the air is good for them. But if you only put them on occasionally, then most of the time they're just not put on, dafka then there's a problem that somehow something might go wrong with it. Okay? ורבי יוסף גאון כתב, במקום שאין שם מי שיודע לתפור תפילין ולבודקן, ויש אצלם ישנות, יניח אותן בלא בדיקה, הואיל ואי אפשר לבודקן ולא לעשותן, ואף אגב נמצא כי תקנה אביד, לא שכר מצוות תפילין. In other words, he says in the case where I do have to have the tefillin checked, but I can't have it checked because I have nobody here who can check them, then you should put them on even without having them checked. At the very least, you'll have some sort of schar mitzvah tefillin. Let's see now the Shulchan Aruch how he rules on this. The Mechaber rules as follows. He says, "Tefillin sheuchzaku bekashrut einan tzrichim bdika leolam." So he rules like the Rambam and the Ikar opinion in Chazal, like Rashbag, the tefillin never need to be checked. However, he does rule like the Orach Chaim that if you only put them on occasionally, they do need to be checked twice every 7 years. The Rama says, you don't have somebody you could check, then you could put it on without checking. Okay. Here, the Mishnah Berurah says as follows, שכל זמן שחיפוין שלם, הרי אין בחזקתן מדדים, ואין חוששים שמא נמחה אותו נקבע. That's the opinion of the Rambam, that as long as they're fully covered, they have their chazaka, they don't need to be checked. ומכל מקום נכון לבודקן מפני שמתקלקלים בני הזיד. The Mishnah Berurah says, nevertheless, it is correct to check. Why? Because due to the sweat, they could get damaged. Some current poskim nowadays say it's not necessary. Like I saw Shalom Zalman Auerbach says, quoted in his name, that nowadays, especially that our tefillin are from all Behemah Gasa, so you don't need to check them, and it's even better not to check them because once you check them, you expose them, and it could actually be more damaging. So some poskim say, current poskim say not like this, that it's actually better not to check. Some say it's still good, like the Mishnah Berurah says, to have them checked every so often. ואם נקרא חיפוי הבתים או שנשארו במים, צריכים בדיקה תכף שמא נמחק אותו מתקלקל. Right, if it got torn, the bite, or if it fell into water, I don't know, maybe if it was exposed to some very bad weather conditions, then it does need to be checked. בכל שצריך בדיקה מדדין ואין לו מי שיבדוק ויתפור אותה, מניחם בלא ברכה, זה לא שייך לאומות יחזקאל, חטא בחיי אדם דו הדין ומכון מלאך, והכל לפי העניין. In other words, let's say I don't have a way to get it checked, so obviously I need to put on. As to where a bracha, he rules here, akol lefi ha'inyan. In other words, you have to see, how much of a concern is it that really they were damaged. If it's just a small concern, you can probably say a bracha. If it was a really big concern, I don't know, you saw it completely got wet, soaked in water, then you shouldn't say a bracha. Okay. There's an interesting discussion. I saw it's not really a halachic discussion. I think it's more of a, trying to comfort people discussion. But Tzitz Eliezer, some other poskim were asked about this as well. Okay. תפילין שקנו אותם בחזקת כשרות למהדרין, והבטיחו לקונה שנבדקו כראוי, וכעבור מספר שנים שנתנו אותם לבדיקה חוזרת, מצאו שבאחד הפרשיות חסרה תיבה אחת בת 2 אותיות, אם מעלין עליו על כמי שלא קיים מצוות תפילין ושהברכות היו ברכות לבטלה. Okay, very unfortunate case. Somebody bought a pair of tefillin. He thought he was buying kasher lemahadrin tefillin. After a few years, he had them checked, and there was a missing word. Okay, so this is not tefillin that were initially kasher, and then later on, got wet or something of the sort. This is tefillin. A missing word means that the tefillin were never kasher to begin with. So it turns out that all these years he was putting on pasul tefillin. So yes, is this considered that if I never fulfilled the mitzvah tefillin and all the brachot that I said were brachot levatala? Okay, yeah, a very unfortunate situation. Unfortunately, it can happen. So he brings here a few interesting sources on this. Again, I don't know. To me, it seems like more he was trying to comfort the person, who asked the question. It was obviously not his fault, but he quotes here a few interesting sources that some say, for example, there's a concept by a Kohen who did avoda, and afterwards it turned out that he was a halal. In other words, that he wasn't a Kohen, because somebody along his father's line was mechalal the kahuna by marrying a woman who's not kosher to kahuna. So there's a halacha that barech Hashem chelo, that b'diavad all the avoda that he did was kosher. So he says, so he brings a source here that you can say the same thing about somebody who put on tefillin all this time, that even though it's pasul tefillin, HaKadosh Baruch Hu accepts it as if they were kosher tefillin. And he quotes a few other sources along those lines that, it's not considered the bracha levatala, because he was an onus. So he says as follows, he says, שבכגון הנחת תפילין וברכותיו שלמסרי הרצויים הם בעיני הקדוש ברוך הוא מעלים עליו כאילו קימם גם עתה. In other words, he did everything he could on pi halacha. He bought for tefillin from what was supposed to be a trustworthy source. He was not required to check it. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu accepts it as if he fulfilled the mitzvah. All right, so that's regarding checking tefillin. Let's go on to the next siman. Unless anybody has any questions or comments on this. Good, so we're going on to siman mem. First halacha that we have in here in siman mem is regarding, are you allowed to hang up the tefillin? Let's say I want to take the tefillin. Again, we don't do this nowadays, obviously, because we put it in like a bag. But theoretically, why not hang it, maybe like put a nail on the wall and hang up the tefillin on it? Okay, so the Gemara in Barachot discusses this. Amar Rabbi Chanina, ani ra'iti et Rebbe shetala tefillin. Rabbi Chanina says he saw Rebbe hang the tefillin. Me'iti ve'ya tolet tefillin yitlu lo chayav. Right, if you hang up the tefillin, your life should be hung. דורשי חמורות אמרו, והיו חייך תלויים לך מנגד, זה התולה תפילין. In other words, somebody who hangs up the tefillin, his life should be hanging against him. In other words, that hanging up the tefillin is a disrespectful way to put up the tefillin. The Gemara says, "Lo kashya ha beretzua ha bektzitza." Depends where you hang it up from. If you hang it up from the retzua, Rashi says, from the strip, and the bite is sort of hanging downwards from there, that's gnai. But if you put the bite on, whatever it is, the nail or whatever it is that you're hanging on, then that's okay. That's the first answer. In other words, it's completely prohibited to hang up tefillin. Doesn't matter whether you hang it up from the retzua or from the bite. Rather, in other words, what Rebbe did was that the tefillin were in a bag, and then he hung the bag up on something, and that's permitted. So the Gemara asks, so it's the chidush if I'm hanging it up from the bag. In other words, I would have thought that tefillin need to be like a sefer Torah, which has to sit down on something. Kamash malan, that you can hang it up. So we see from here that you cannot hang up the tefillin directly, but if you put them in the bag, then you are allowed to hang up that bag on something. So you can hang it up on, I don't know, some sort of, what do you call those things? A vav. I forget what it's called in English. On some sort of peg or hanger or whatever, you are allowed to hang up the tefillin as long as you're hanging up the bag. However, by a sefer Torah, that's prohibited. A sefer Torah, it has to be on the munach. It can't be hanging on anything, not even from, something covering it. Sefer Torah, it has to be sitting on something. Okay, that's what the Rambam rules. So לתלות את התפילין בין ברצועה בין בתפילה עצמה ותולה אותה כיס שהתפילין מונחים בו. Okay, let's see. Shulchan Aruch this, and there Shulchan Aruch is straightforward, but their Mishnah Berurah here adds quite a bit. So the Mechaber says, "Asur litלות tefillin bein babatim bein beretzuot, aval mutar litlotan bekisan." Again, as we said, not allowed to hang up tefillin either by the ritzua or by the bayit, but you are allowed to hang them up in their bag. And the reason is that it's considered derech bizayon. Here the Mishnah Berurah says, "Umikol makom ba'akrai be'alma, שאוחז התפילין בידו והרצויות תלויות למטה, אין להקפיד." Okay, this obviously, anytime, I'm not even sure what the Havamina here is, but anytime you're holding on the tefillin, although you could say maybe then you're in the process of putting them on, you hold up your tefillin, so anytime, the ritzuot are sort of hanging downwards. In other words, when you lift up the tefillin, you shouldn't take them by the ritzua and let the bayit hang from there. Okay, in other words, you should always hold it by the bayit. It's not respectful to hold it by ritzua and then have the bayit sort of hanging down. However, he says, "אין בכלל זה מה שהתלויים של ראש, תפילין של ראש תלוי באוויר, הוא מחזיק ביד הרצועות ומסומם על הראש, כי זהו צורך הנחתן." Okay, he says, if though you need it when you put it on, when you hold it by the straps, and then the tefillin shel rosh are a bit hanging, that's okay, because that's in order to put them on. Again, to me, it's not even clear why even that's so necessary, because, I don't know, at least the way I do it, you sort of put it on the head, and then you adjust the straps. But maybe there are some people that, do it by holding on to the straps. He says, "V'yesh manichin, asher rosh al hadaf v'chadom mishah shel lofshin." In other words, they lean it on some sort of shelf, so that it won't be hanging. Okay. Sefer Torah, now he addresses Bekisan, but he says Sefer Torah asur litlota bechol gavne. Efilu k'shei ba'aron kodesh. In other words, even within the aron kodesh, you can't hang up the Sefer Torah on anything. It has to be sitting on the aron. ותולה ארון קודש. ועיין בחיי אדם שכתב, אפילו כשארון הקודש מחובר ביחידות לכותל אסור, כל שאין תחתיו עומד דבר מה. From the way the Mishnah Berurah quotes the חיי אדם, it sounds like that even the Aron Kodesh cannot be hanging by being attached to the wall. And the Aron Kodesh needs to be sitting on the ground. This was very strange to me. So I found that there's a tshuva with a Minchat Yitzchak. Basically, here is the question: אם מותר ליתן ארון קודש לספר תורה על דף הקבוע בקיר? In other words, if I have like a shelf from the wall and I want to place on that the aron kodesh, whether that's permitted, whether that's considered like it's talui, because again, it's not any way connected to the ground. So he actually quotes here that the Neshmat Adam says that, Neshmat Adam, which is the commentary of the Adam, says explicitly that that's permitted. He's not so clear here whether the Mishnah Berurah means to disagree with that or not, but he says, he says, in other words, that it is permitted. In other words, if it's connected to the wall, that's not considered that it's hanging. In other words, it's considered that it's sitting properly. Okay, I don't know. To me, it seems, I haven't checked really, but to me it seems that some places do have the Aron Kodesh not as something sitting on the ground, but just as something attached to the wall. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but I think I've seen that. Okay, anyway, if it is, then there are sources for that. He says here, "Sfarim kegon sifrei Talmud v'chadome dome letfilin." Right, sfarim are like tefillin. So as long as if you put them in a bag, then you can hang up the bag. It's not like Sefer Torah. So obviously, if you have a backpack with books inside, you're allowed to hang that up on something. Again, you're not hanging the books directly. However, let's say the book itself has some sort of chain to it, then to hang it up by the chain, that's like the siddur itself. So that's not respectful. It should be in a bag. Okay, he also says here, "Mutar lichtov psukim beniyar v'litotan b'petach beit hakneset." If you want to just write a pasuk on a piece of paper to hang it up on the entrance to the wall and to the shul, that is permitted. It's not considered like you're hanging a book, because again, this was something that you wrote, designed to be hung, so it's not considered disrespectful. Finally, he quotes here, "נוהגים העולם להתענות כשנופל תפילין מידו על הארץ בלא נרתיקן, הוא הדין כשנופל ספר תורה אפילו בנרתיקן." Right, so if the tefillin fall, again, the bite of the tefillin falls on the ground and it's not in the box, not in anything, then there's a custom to fast. Some people give tzedakah. And as we know, Sefer Torah, even if it's covered, if it falls, then you fast. Again, there are many, many details on this. I put here in the source page of the Tshuvas Tziliya, there goes some of it. What does it actually means that the Sefer Torah falls? What part of it fell? Who has to fast? Just the person that fell? Anybody who saw it? Anybody who was in the film? Yeah, a lot of discussions on all of this, as is well known. Right, any questions or comments? Okay.
Regarding to the last, the one before,
Right.
I really thought I was very makpid to only buy from a seif, which I personally know. I mean, just as they say in Yerushalayim, there are many seifim with like Badatz cash or whatever there.
Yeah.
Is it wrong, so to speak, just to be makpid, just to buy from something you personally know, or?
Obviously, that's the best. If it's somebody that you know and you feel most confident about that, then that's probably the best.
Mm.
I have a, I mean, there's one sofer I know. I mean, I know several sofer. There's one sofer I know. I didn't buy from him tefillin yet, although I might in the future because I want to do. But anyway, I just from speaking to him, he knew the halachot and the sugyot so well. It seemed like this is a really good person, to buy from. So, yeah, I think to me that sounds like the best.
Mm.
A lot of these ashgachot, I don't know exactly what they do and what kind of checks they do. Sometimes, there are certain tests that are giving to Sofrim, that's done, like in Shemirat Astam. It could be that they're doing more and actually overseeing the process. I don't know. I don't know what's involved in that. But if somebody that you know and trust, that's probably the best.
And also regarding checking tefillin, not checking tefillin, I have in my possession the tefillin of my great-grandfather, who had his bar mitzvah, or not to really count, somewhere around 1903, 1904.
Wow.
Still kosher to this day.
Amazing. Very nice. Wow. I have a feeling for my wife's grandfather. We haven't had them checked yet, though. I mean, nobody puts them on, so I guess we would need to check it if we would want to use it. But yeah, amazing. Oh, Hashem. All right, very good. So Shavua Tov and Chag Shavuot Sameach to everyone.
Chag Shavuot Sameach.